You don't belong here, the man said, just before the water left his hand and shattered the silence of the marble floor like something fragile breaking in public. The splash wasn't loud, but it echoed, sharp and clean, against the high glass ceilings of Brookshire Mall, where everything was polished, controlled, and carefully curated to look untouched by struggle. Isaiah Brooks didn't flinch. Not when the cold water struck his face. Not when it soaked through the thin fabric of his worn jacket. Not even when a few people nearby slowed their steps, their eyes flickering with that familiar mix of curiosity and distance. He simply stood there, still as a statue placed where it didn't belong. Droplets slid down his cheeks, tracing quiet paths along skin weathered by years that no one here could read. His hands, rough and steady, remained at his sides. No sudden movement. No raised voice. Just breath, slow and measured, visible in the cool air drifting in from the automatic doors behind him. Richard Collins adjusted his cuff as if nothing unusual had happened. His posture remained straight, composed, every inch the manager of a place that demanded order. I told you already, he continued, his tone flat, controlled, the kind of voice that expected compliance without question. You can't stand here. Customers are complaining. The word customers lingered in the air longer than it should have, like a boundary drawn without needing to be explained. Isaiah blinked once, clearing the water from his eyes. For a brief second, the overhead lights reflected in them, bright and distant, like something remembered rather than seen. At his feet, a small, worn leather wallet lay just inches from his shoe, darkened slightly where a few drops of water had landed. He looked down at it, then back up, not at Richard, but past him, toward the wide corridor where people moved in practice rhythms, arms filled with shopping bags, conversations blending into a soft, constant hum. The world kept going. It always did. A child's laughter echoed faintly from somewhere near the escalators. A distant announcement chimed over the intercom, cheerful and indifferent. Somewhere, a coffee machine hissed. Life, uninterrupted. Isaiah bent slowly, not hurried, not defensive, just deliberate. His fingers closed gently around the wallet, careful, almost respectful, as if it didn't belong to him. He brushed it lightly with the edge of his sleeve, wiping away the moisture, his movements precise despite the tremor that flickered through his hands from the cold. Richard watched him, eyes narrowing slightly, already forming a conclusion before the moment had finished unfolding. What do you think you're doing? He asked, sharper now, stepping forward just enough to reclaim space. A security guard nearby shifted his weight, sensing the tension but not yet intervening. Isaiah straightened, the wallet now resting in his palm. He didn't clutch it. He didn't hide it. He simply held it out in front of him, as if offering something back to a world that had already decided it had nothing to give him in return. His voice, when it came, was quiet, steady, carrying just enough to reach the space between them without breaking it. Someone's looking for this, he said. No anger. No plea. Just a statement, simple and clear. For a moment, something almost imperceptible passed through the air, like a shift too subtle to name. The mall didn't stop, but a few more heads turned. A woman paused near a storefront, her hand tightening slightly around the strap of her purse. The security guard glanced from Isaiah to Richard, uncertain now, as if the situation had slipped just outside the script he was used to following. Water continued to drip from the edge of Isaiah's sleeve, tapping softly against the marble below, each drop marking time in a space that suddenly felt too still, too aware. Richard exhaled through his nose, impatience tightening his jaw. Give it here, he said, extending his hand, not as a request, but as an expectation. Isaiah didn't move immediately. Not out of defiance, but as if he was listening to something deeper than the words spoken in front of him. Then, slowly, he stepped forward, closing the distance by a single measured pace, the wallet still resting openly in his hand, the light catching its worn edges, revealing years of use, of being carried, of belonging somewhere before ending up here, on this floor, in this moment that felt small to some and everything to others. Isaiah's hand did not shake as he extended the wallet, but the air around him carried a quiet weight, something unseen yet undeniable, like the pause before a storm that no one had predicted. Up close, the details became harder to ignore. The stitching on his jacket, though worn, had once been precise. The collar, though faded, was carefully folded. Even now, even standing there soaked and out of place, there was a kind of order to him that did not match the word homeless that had already formed in Richard's mind. Richard took the wallet without thanks, his fingers brushing briefly against Isaiah's, and for a split second, the contrast lingered, one hand soft and conditioned, the other marked by time and weather, yet steady in a way that felt grounded rather than broken. Richard flipped the wallet open with a practiced motion, his eyes scanning quickly, expecting something simple, something that confirmed what he already believed. An identification card. A few bills. Maybe nothing at all. But the first thing he saw was not what he expected. It was a photograph, slightly bent at the edges, tucked carefully into the inner sleeve. A woman stood in the center, her smile wide, her arm wrapped around a young girl who looked no older than 8. Behind them, a man stood taller, his expression calm, one hand resting gently on the girl's shoulder. The image was sunlit, warm, the kind of moment people frame, the kind they protect. Richard's eyes narrowed, not in curiosity, but in resistance, as if the photo did not belong in this moment. He turned the card beneath it. The name printed there caught the light for just a second too long. Isaiah Brooks. The letters were clean, official, unchanged by time even if everything else had been. Richard's jaw tightened, his mind already moving to close the gap between what he saw and what he wanted to believe. People lose things, he told himself silently. People fall. It does not mean anything. He snapped the wallet shut, the sound sharper than necessary, and held it out again, this time not as an object returned, but as something dismissed. Stay where you are, he said, his voice low, controlled, but edged now with something less certain. The security guard stepped closer, his shoes clicking softly against the marble, each step measured, waiting for direction that had not fully formed. Isaiah did not reach for the wallet right away. His eyes remained on it for a moment, then lifted, not to challenge, not to defend, but simply to meet the space where Richard stood. There was no accusation in his gaze. No demand. Just presence. Around them, the movement of the mall shifted slightly, like a current adjusting course. A couple slowed their pace. A teenager lowered his phone halfway, uncertain whether to keep recording. The woman near the storefront had not moved. Her eyes were fixed now, not on Richard, but on Isaiah, her expression changing in ways that had not yet reached the surface. Isaiah finally took the wallet back, his fingers closing around it with quiet familiarity. He slipped it into the inner pocket of his jacket, pressing it flat against his chest, as if anchoring something that could not be replaced. Thank you, he said softly, though the words did not carry gratitude in the way they were usually meant. They carried closure, something finished rather than given. Richard exhaled, longer this time, his control returning in layers. You need to leave, he said again, more firmly now, reclaiming the role that made everything simple. This is private property. The phrase settled between them, official, practiced, a line drawn not just in space, but in worth. Isaiah nodded once, a small movement, almost imperceptible. He turned slightly toward the glass doors, the light from outside spilling across the floor in long, pale strips that stretched toward him without touching. His shoes, worn and uneven, made almost no sound as he shifted his weight. For a moment, it seemed like the scene would end there, like so many others had, quietly, without consequence, absorbed into the background of a place that never stopped moving. But then something changed. It was not loud. Not sudden. Just a single sound that did not belong to the rhythm of them all. A breath. Caught too sharply. A step taken too quickly. And somewhere behind Richard, a voice, barely above a whisper, broke through the space with a tremor that carried more weight than anything said before. Wait. The word hung there, fragile, uncertain, but enough to stop what had already begun to move forward. Isaiah paused, his body still angled toward the exit, but his head turning slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge the shift. The woman who had been standing near the storefront was no longer still. She was closer now, her steps unsteady, her eyes locked onto Isaiah with a focus that felt deeper than recognition, deeper than surprise. Something in her face was unraveling, piece by piece, as if the moment in front of her was pulling something long buried to the surface. Her hand lifted slowly, not reaching, not yet, just hovering in the space between certainty and disbelief. And in that fragile space, everything that had seemed so clear just seconds ago began to feel uncertain. The word did not echo, yet it carried farther than anything that had been said before, threading its way through the polished air and settling into the space between every paused step and half-turned head. Isaiah remained still, his body angled toward the exit, but something in his shoulders shifted, not tense, not defensive, just aware. Slowly he turned, not fully at first, just enough for his gaze to meet the direction of the voice. The woman moved closer, her heels no longer steady against the marble, each step uneven, as if the ground beneath her had lost its certainty. Up close, the details sharpened. Her hair, neatly styled just moments ago, now framed a face that had gone pale, her composure unraveling in quiet layers. Her eyes did not move away from Isaiah, not even for a second, as if looking away would break something fragile that had just begun to form. Richard turned as well, irritation flashing first, quick and instinctive, then fading into something more cautious as he took in the shift in her expression. "Ma'am, is there a problem?" he asked, his voice returning to its polished tone, the one reserved for customers, for control. But she did not answer him. Not right away. Her attention stayed fixed on Isaiah, her breathing uneven now, audible in the small space that had formed around them. The sounds of the mall seemed to dim, not because they had stopped, but because something else had taken their place, something heavier, more focused. Isaiah met her gaze without hesitation. There was no recognition in his expression at first, only patience, the kind that had learned to wait without expectation. He did not step forward. He did not speak. He simply stood there, present in a way that made the moment feel anchored, real. The woman took another step, then another, closing the distance until only a few feet remained between them. Her hand lifted slightly, trembling now, as if reaching toward a memory rather than a person. "It cannot be," she whispered, the words barely forming, more breath than voice. Richard's posture stiffened. "Ma'am, if you need assistance, I can have someone help you," he said, glancing briefly toward the security guard, who now stood fully attentive, uncertain which direction the moment would turn. Still, she did not look at him. Her eyes traced Isaiah's face slowly, searching, confirming, unraveling something that had been held together for too long. "Isaiah?" she said, this time clearer, though her voice carried a weight that bent under its own certainty. The name landed differently now. Not as a label. Not as a line in a wallet. But as something lived, something known. Isaiah's expression changed, but only slightly. A flicker, brief and quiet, passed through his eyes, like a reflection of something distant that had not been called back in years. He studied her now with more attention, his gaze steady, searching not for proof, but for truth. "Yes," he said softly. Just one word. No more. It was enough. The reaction was immediate, though not loud. Her breath caught sharply, her hand rising to her mouth as if to hold something inside that could no longer be contained. For a moment she stood frozen, her body caught between disbelief and recognition, between the present and something that had not been allowed to surface until now. Richard glanced between them, the control he had maintained beginning to thin. "Do you know this man?" he asked, the question sharper now, edged with something that was no longer just authority, but uncertainty. The woman lowered her hand slowly, her eyes never leaving Isaiah. There were tears now, not falling yet, but gathering, held at the edge of something that could not stay contained for long. "Know him?" she repeated, her voice breaking slightly, not from weakness, but from the weight of memory pressing forward. She took one final step closer, close enough now to see the details others had ignored, the lines, the wear, the quiet strength that had never fully disappeared. Her knees seemed to falter, just slightly, as if the moment itself was too much to stand inside without giving way. And in that suspended second, before anything else could be said, before Richard could reclaim control or the crowd could decide what they were witnessing, the truth began to rise, not as a revelation spoken aloud, but as something undeniable written across her face, something that said this man standing soaked and overlooked was not who they thought he was, and had never been. Her knees gave way not in collapse, but in surrender to a truth too heavy to carry standing. The sound of them meeting the marble floor was soft, almost swallowed by the vastness of the space, yet it cut through everything that had come before. A few people gasped, not loudly, but enough to ripple outward, enough to shift the weight of the moment from curiosity to something deeper, something unsettled. Sophia Bennet did not seem to notice. Her gaze never left Isaiah. The world around her, the polished storefronts, the quiet hum of distant conversations, the presence of strangers watching, all of it faded into the background as if it no longer belonged to her reality. "I looked for you," she said, her voice trembling now, each word pulled from somewhere buried deep and untouched for years. Her hands rested lightly against her thighs, fingers curled slightly, as if unsure whether to reach for him or hold herself together. "We all did." Isaiah stood still, the faint drip of water from his sleeve continuing to mark time on the floor between them. His expression did not break, but something behind it shifted, subtle, controlled, like a door opening just enough to let light touch a space long kept in shadow. "Sophia," he said quietly, her name forming with care, not surprise, but recognition that carried weight, memory, and something else that could not yet be named. Richard's breath caught, though he did not realize it at first. The scene in front of him had slipped beyond the boundaries of his understanding, beyond the simple categories he had placed around it. "Ma'am, please stand up," he said, his voice tighter now, less certain, the authority still there but no longer absolute. "There is no need for this." But there was. And everyone could feel it. Sophia shook her head slowly, a small, deliberate movement. Tears finally broke free, tracing warm paths down her cheeks, catching the light in a way that made them impossible to ignore. "You disappeared," she continued, her voice gaining strength even as it trembled. "No calls. No letters. Nothing. They said you left. They said you chose to go." The words hung there, heavy with years of unanswered questions, of stories told without truth. Isaiah listened without interruption. He did not move closer. He did not step back. He simply stood, allowing her words to reach him, to settle, to exist without resistance. Around them, the space tightened. The security guard lowered his stance slightly, no longer advancing. The people who had been watching shifted, not leaving, but staying with a different kind of attention now, one that carried respect, even if they did not fully understand why. Richard glanced at the faces around him, noticing the change, the way the moment had turned, the way control had slipped quietly from his hands without anyone announcing it. Sophia drew in a shaky breath, steadying herself just enough to continue. "My father," she said, her voice softening, the memory reshaping her tone. "The night of the accident. The storm. The bridge was out. No one knew until it was too late." Her eyes searched Isaiah's face, as if needing to see the past reflected there to believe it had truly happened. "They said a stranger pulled him out? Said whoever it was disappeared before anyone could even ask their name?" Isaiah's gaze lowered briefly, not in shame, but in acknowledgement, as if the memory itself carried weight he had learned to hold quietly. "You were there," Sophia whispered, the realization no longer fragile, but certain. "You saved him." The truth settled into the space like something undeniable, something that could not be undone or reinterpreted. Richard's chest tightened, the simplicity of his earlier judgment unraveling in the face of something far more complex than he had allowed himself to see. He looked at Isaiah again, really looked this time, and the image no longer aligned with the story he had already written in his mind. Isaiah exhaled slowly, the breath visible for just a second before it faded. He would have done the same, he said, his voice calm, steady, offering no claim, no ownership over what had been done. Sophia shook her head again, more firmly now, her tears falling freely. "No," she said. "No, not everyone would have." The words carried a quiet truth that settled into the silence that followed. The mall, once filled with movement and noise, now felt suspended, as if waiting, as if listening. And in that stillness, the distance between who Isaiah appeared to be and who he truly was began to collapse, not through explanation, but through the weight of a single moment that refused to be ignored. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt full, heavy with everything that had just been uncovered and everything that had yet to be said. Isaiah remained where he stood, water still clinging to the edges of his sleeve, his posture unchanged, but the space around him no longer treated him as invisible. That had shifted. Completely. Sophia's hands pressed lightly against the floor as if grounding herself in the reality of what she had found, her breathing still uneven but steadier now, anchored by certainty instead of confusion. "We built a foundation in your name," she said softly, her voice no longer breaking, but carrying something deeper, something shaped by years of gratitude that had never found its direction. "My father never forgot. Not once. He spent months trying to find you. We hired people. We searched records. But you were just gone." Isaiah's eyes lowered slightly, not avoiding her, but acknowledging the weight of what she was saying. There was no pride in his expression. No sense of recognition for what had been done in his name. Only a quiet acceptance, like someone who had already made peace with being unseen. "Some things are meant to pass through quietly," he said, his voice calm, almost gentle, as if the truth he carried did not need to be defended or explained. Richard shifted where he stood, the ground beneath his authority no longer solid. The scene had moved beyond him, beyond his control, and he could feel it in the way people were now looking, not at Isaiah, but at him. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. The same eyes that had once glanced at Isaiah with dismissal now held something else when they turned toward Richard. Something questioning. Something unsettled. "This does not change the situation," Richard said, though the words lacked the firmness they had carried before. "Policies are still policies." But even as he spoke, it sounded thinner, like something repeated out of habit rather than belief. Sophia slowly lifted her head, her eyes finding Richard for the first time since she had dropped to her knees. The change in her expression was immediate. The softness that had been there when she looked at Isaiah was gone, replaced by something sharper, not anger, but clarity. "Policies?" she repeated quietly, rising just enough to shift her weight, though she remained low, grounded in the moment. "You threw water on him." The words were not loud, but they landed harder than anything raised in anger could have. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out right away. The image replayed itself in his mind, no longer justified by context or position, but exposed for what it had been. A choice. A moment. One that could not be undone. Isaiah did not look at Richard. He did not step into the space that had opened for him. He remained exactly where he was, as if the truth did not belong to him to wield, only to exist. The security guard took a step back, not commanded, not directed, but instinctively, as if recognizing that whatever this moment was, it was no longer something to enforce, but something to witness. Sophia pushed herself up slowly, her legs unsteady at first, but her posture finding strength as she rose. She stood now between Isaiah and Richard, not as a barrier, but as a bridge between two realities that had just collided. "Do you even know who he is?" she asked, her voice steady now, controlled, but carrying an intensity that filled the space. Richard hesitated. Just for a second. And in that second, the answer became obvious. "He is a man you decided did not matter," Sophia continued, her eyes unwavering. "That is who you saw." The words hung there, stripping away titles, roles, and assumptions until only the truth remained. Around them, the crowd had grown, not in noise, but in presence. People were no longer passing by. They were staying. Watching. Listening. The energy of the space had changed completely, no longer indifferent, no longer detached. It was focused. A quiet accountability had settled in, one that did not need to be announced to be felt. Isaiah finally moved, but not forward, not toward confrontation. He simply adjusted his jacket, pulling it slightly closer around himself, the fabric still damp, the chill still present. His movements were small, controlled, grounded in something that did not depend on the approval of anyone around him. He glanced once more toward the exit, the light beyond the glass doors still waiting, unchanged, steady. Then back to Sophia. There was a question in his eyes, not spoken, not urgent, just present. A question of whether this moment would hold or pass like so many before it. And for the first time, it felt like the answer might be different. The moment did not rush forward. It settled. Like dust after something unseen had shifted the air, leaving everything suspended in a quiet that felt heavier than noise. Isaiah's breath came slow, visible in faint traces against the cool glass-lit space, his eyes resting on Sophia not with urgency, but with a kind of calm that had learned to exist without expectation. Around them, the crowd had stopped pretending to move. Conversations had softened into murmurs, then into silence, as if everyone understood, without being told, that something real was unfolding in front of them. Sophia stood still, her shoulders rising and falling as she steadied herself, the earlier tremor in her body giving way to something more grounded, more deliberate. Her gaze softened again when it returned to Isaiah, no longer searching, no longer questioning, but holding. Just holding. "You are cold," she said quietly, the words simple, almost out of place in a moment filled with so much weight, yet somehow more powerful because of it. Isaiah glanced down at his sleeve, where the last drops of water still clung before falling, one by one, onto the marble floor. The sound was soft, rhythmic, steady. He did not brush it away. "It will dry," he replied, his voice calm, as if discomfort had long ago stopped being something he reacted to. Sophia shook her head gently, not in disagreement, but in recognition of something deeper than the words themselves. She stepped closer, just half a step, closing the space not out of urgency, but intention. "You always said that," she murmured, more to the memory than to the moment. "You always made things sound smaller than they were." Isaiah's expression shifted slightly, not a smile, not quite, but something close to it, something that carried warmth without needing to show it fully. The light above them reflected faintly in his eyes, steady, unshaken. Richard remained where he stood, but his presence had changed. The authority that once defined his posture had thinned into something quieter, something uncertain. His hands, once neatly folded or confidently placed, now hovered without purpose, as if unsure where they belonged. He watched the exchange, but no longer from a position above it. Something had leveled. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just undeniably. A janitor from a nearby store paused at the edge of the gathering, a cleaning cart beside him, its wheels still. A mother held her child a little closer, not out of fear, but out of awareness. Even the security guard, trained to act, to step in, to control, now stood still, his stance softened, his role momentarily undefined. Isaiah shifted his weight slightly, his shoes making the faintest sound against the floor, a reminder that he was still here, still grounded in a place that had not been built for him. He looked toward the glass doors again, where the light outside had not changed, still bright, still indifferent, still waiting. Then back to Sophia. "You should not be on your knees for anyone," he said quietly, though she was no longer kneeling. The words carried something deeper than instruction. They carried dignity, offered gently, without force. Sophia's lips pressed together, her eyes glistening again, but this time the emotion did not overwhelm her. It steadied her. "And you should not be treated like you do not belong," she answered, her voice firm now, not loud, but clear enough to settle into the space around them. The words did not echo, but they stayed. Richard lowered his gaze for a brief second, just long enough for the shift to be seen, even if he tried to recover it. The marble beneath them reflected faint outlines, distorted by the thin layer of water that had not yet dried, turning the perfect surface into something imperfect, something real. Isaiah exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him without tension. He did not respond right away. He did not need to. The moment had already said more than words could carry. Somewhere in the distance, the soft chime of the mall clock marked the passing of another minute, though it felt as if time had stretched, widened, allowed space for something that usually passed too quickly to notice. And in that quiet expansion, the lines that had once separated people so clearly, so easily, no longer felt fixed. They felt fragile. Temporary. As if, with enough truth, enough stillness, they could disappear entirely without anyone needing to break them. The shift did not announce itself with noise or movement, but it arrived all the same, settling into Richard's chest with a quiet weight that made it harder to stand the way he had before. He looked at Isaiah again, not as a problem to remove, not as a disruption to manage, but as a person standing in front of him, unchanged, yet now impossible to reduce into something smaller. The water on Isaiah's jacket had begun to dry in uneven patches, leaving faint outlines that caught the light differently, imperfect against the otherwise flawless surface of the mall. Richard noticed it. Not the stain itself, but the contrast. For a moment, he saw the scene as others might have seen it, stripped of his role, stripped of his assumptions. A man standing still. Another man standing in judgment. And the distance between them, not measured in feet, but in something harder to define. His throat tightened slightly, though he did not speak right away. The words that had come so easily before no longer fit the moment. They felt misplaced, hollow. Around them, the stillness held, but it was no longer fragile. It was firm now, anchored by truth that had already surfaced. Sophia remained beside Isaiah, her presence steady, no longer trembling, no longer searching. She did not need to say anything more. What had been revealed was enough. Isaiah's gaze drifted briefly across the space, taking in the people who had gathered, the quiet attention, the subtle shift in how they stood, how they looked, how they understood. Then his eyes returned to Richard, not demanding anything, not accusing, just present, as they had always been. That presence made it harder to look away. Richard exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him heavier than before. His shoulders lowered just slightly. A change small enough to go unnoticed by most, but enough to break the rigid line he had held since the beginning. He started, then stopped, the word incomplete, unfamiliar in this context. He had spoken thousands of times in this building, given instructions, enforced rules, maintained order. But this was different. This required something else. Something he was not used to offering. His eyes dropped briefly to the floor, to the faint marks left by the water, then lifted again. "I did not know," he said finally, the sentence simple, but carrying the weight of everything he had not seen. The words hung there, but they did not resolve anything. They did not undo the moment. They only acknowledged it. Isaiah listened, his expression unchanged, not hardened, not softened, just steady. "You did not look," he replied quietly. There was no edge in his voice, no accusation sharpened for impact. Just truth, placed gently where it belonged. The distinction settled into the space with more force than any raised voice could have carried. Richard absorbed it without defense this time. He did not argue. He did not correct. He stood there, facing something he could not redirect or dismiss. The silence that followed was not empty. It was reflective, like a mirror held up without distortion. The security guard shifted again, but this time not out of uncertainty, more out of recognition that his role had ended before it had begun. The people watching did not move away. They stayed, not out of curiosity anymore, but because leaving now would feel like missing something important, something real. Sophia glanced briefly at Richard, then back to Isaiah, her expression calm, grounded, no longer driven by urgency. She did not need to defend him. He had already stood for himself in the quietest way possible. Isaiah adjusted his jacket once more, smoothing it lightly, not to remove the dampness, but simply as a habit, a gesture of care for something that still belonged to him. His posture remained upright, his presence unchanged by the shift around him. He had not grown larger in this moment. The world had simply stopped shrinking him. Richard took a small step forward, not closing the distance entirely, but enough to signal something different, something tentative. "I am sorry," he said, the words quieter than anything he had said before, not projected, not performed, but offered. They did not carry authority. They carried humility, unfamiliar and unpracticed. For a second, no one moved. No one spoke. The apology did not erase what had happened. It did not restore the moment to what it had been. But it changed something. Subtly. Permanently. Isaiah regarded him for a brief moment, his eyes steady, searching not for perfection, but for sincerity. Then he gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible, not as acceptance of the action, but acknowledgement of the attempt. It was enough. The tension in the space eased, not disappearing, but shifting into something quieter, something that allowed breath to return. The mall, once frozen, began to move again, slowly, carefully, as if aware that something meaningful had just passed through it. And in that movement, the memory of the moment remained, not loud, not dramatic, but deeply felt, carried in the way people would walk differently, look differently, even long after Isaiah Brooks stepped away from the place where he had once been told he did not belong. The air did not return to what it had been before, not entirely. Something had changed too deeply for that, settling into the space like a quiet imprint that would not fade with movement alone. Isaiah stood there for a moment longer, his eyes resting on Richard not with judgment, not with expectation, but with a calm that made everything else feel louder by comparison. Then, without announcement, without needing permission, he shifted his weight and turned toward the glass doors once more. This time, there was no hesitation in the movement. His steps were slow, steady, measured against the smooth floor that reflected faint traces of the moment left behind. Sophia watched him go, her chest rising slightly as if something inside her was catching up to what had just happened. "Wait," she said again, but this time her voice carried less urgency and more intention. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them with a quiet determination that did not need to be loud to be felt. Isaiah paused, not immediately turning, as if giving the moment space to complete itself before responding. When he did look back, it was the same calm presence, unchanged, steady. Sophia reached into her purse, her hands no longer trembling, but purposeful now, grounded in clarity. She pulled out a small, neatly folded card, its edges crisp, untouched by time or wear. For a brief second, she looked down at it, then back up at him, her expression softening once more, not with uncertainty, but with something closer to resolve. "You disappeared," she said quietly, stepping closer until she stood just a few feet away from him again. "But you do not have to stay gone." The words were not a command. They were an offering. She extended the card toward him, her hand steady, open. The name embossed on it caught the light, simple, elegant, carrying weight without needing explanation. "Come see us," she continued, her voice low, but clear enough to settle between them. "My father would want that. He has wanted that for years." Isaiah looked at the card, but did not take it right away. His gaze lingered there, not dismissing it, not reaching for it, just considering it as something that existed outside the rhythm he had built for himself. For a moment, the world around them seemed to hold its breath again, though more softly this time, less fragile, more respectful. Richard remained in place, his earlier authority now replaced by quiet observation. He did not interrupt. He did not step in. He simply watched, his understanding still unfolding, still adjusting to a reality that had not asked for his permission to change. Isaiah finally lifted his hand, slow and deliberate, and took the card. His fingers brushed against Sophia's briefly, but neither pulled away quickly. The contact was light, almost unnoticeable, yet it carried a sense of connection that went beyond the moment itself. He turned the card slightly, reading it, though the exact words did not matter as much as what it represented. Opportunity. Recognition. A door that had not been opened before. He slipped the card carefully into the same inner pocket as the wallet, pressing it flat, not out of habit this time, but with intention, as if acknowledging its place beside something that already mattered. "I am glad he made it home," Isaiah said softly, his voice carrying a quiet warmth that had been there all along, just beneath the surface. Sophia's eyes filled again, but she did not let the tears fall this time. She held them, steady, just like everything else. "Because of you," she replied. Isaiah shook his head slightly, not rejecting the truth, but reframing it in the way he always had. "Because it was time," he said. The simplicity of the words settled into the space between them, grounding the moment in something that did not need to be owned or explained. He gave her a small nod, one that carried more meaning than any extended farewell could have. Then he turned again, this time continuing toward the doors without. Pause. The automatic glass panels slid open as he approached, the outside light spilling in, bright, unfiltered, indifferent to what had just happened inside. He stepped through, his figure moving into the open air beyond, where the sounds were different, less controlled, more real. Inside, the mall slowly resumed its rhythm, footsteps returning, voices rising, the hum of normal life reclaiming its place. But it was not the same. Not exactly. Richard stood where he was, his gaze lingering on the doorway long after Isaiah had passed through it. His reflection stared back at him faintly from the polished floor, no longer as certain as it had been before. Sophia remained still for a moment, her hand lowering slowly to her side, her posture relaxed, but grounded in something that would not fade. The card was gone from her hand, but its purpose had already been fulfilled. And somewhere beyond the glass, a man who had once been told he did not belong walked forward without looking back, carrying with him nothing more than what he had always carried, and yet somehow, something more. Outside, the air felt different. Not cleaner, not warmer, just real in a way the polished interior could never fully imitate. Isaiah stepped onto the concrete walkway, the faint sound of traffic in the distance blending with the low hum of the city moving at its own pace. The sunlight touched the damp edges of his jacket, softening them, turning what had been cold into something almost neutral. He did not rush. He did not look back. Each step carried the same quiet rhythm he had walked with long before anyone inside had noticed him. Behind the glass, the reflection of the mall lingered faintly, a world of order and control that now felt smaller than it had just minutes ago. Inside, Richard remained near the spot where everything had shifted, though the crowd had begun to disperse, slowly returning to their routines. Conversations resumed, footsteps echoed again, but softer, more measured, as if something unspoken had settled into the space and would not easily leave. Richard looked down at the marble floor, at the faint outlines left by water that had nearly dried, leaving only subtle traces where something had happened. He could still see it, even as it faded. His own reflection stared back at him, distorted slightly by the uneven sheen of the surface. For the first time in a long while, it did not feel like a confirmation of who he was. It felt like a question. His shoulders lowered again, not from fatigue, but from something closer to release, as if the rigid shape he had held himself in had quietly broken without needing to shatter. He glanced toward the doors, toward the place where Isaiah had disappeared into the open light, and the distance between them no longer felt defined by space alone. Sophia stood a few feet away, her posture relaxed but grounded, her gaze no longer searching for Isaiah, but holding on to the moment that had just passed through her life and changed its direction. She exhaled slowly, the breath steady, controlled, her hands resting at her sides. The absence of the card in her hand was noticeable, but it was not a loss. It was a beginning, placed where it needed to be. A janitor resumed pushing his cart down the corridor, the wheels rolling softly over the polished surface, the familiar sound now carrying a different weight. A child's laughter returned near the escalators, light and unburdened, as if the world had decided to keep moving, but with a memory attached to it. Richard took a step forward, then stopped, unsure where that movement was meant to lead. There was no instruction to follow, no protocol to restore what had already changed. The rules he had relied on no longer felt complete. They had not accounted for what had just happened. They had not seen what he had failed to see. He lifted his hand slightly, then let it fall again, the gesture unfinished, unnecessary. There was nothing to fix in the immediate sense. Nothing to correct in the way he was used to. Only something to carry. The awareness settled into him slowly, not as a burden, but as something quieter, something that would remain long after the moment itself faded from the surface. Sophia turned her head slightly, her eyes moving once more toward the glass doors, though Isaiah was no longer visible. There was no urgency in her expression now. No need to chase. The connection had already been made. The rest would come in its own time, or not at all. And that was enough. Outside, Isaiah continued walking, the city unfolding around him without ceremony. A bus passed in the distance. A breeze moved lightly through the air, catching the edges of his jacket, now nearly dry. He reached into his inner pocket briefly, his fingers brushing against the worn leather of the wallet, then the smooth edge of the card beside it. He did not take them out. He did not need to. He let his hand rest there for a moment, then withdrew it, his stride unchanged. The sidewalk stretched ahead, open, unmarked, not offering direction, only space. He moved through it with the same quiet presence he had always carried, unaffected by the recognition behind him, unchanged by the apology that had come too late to alter what had been, but not too late to mean something. Back inside, the last traces of water disappeared completely, leaving the floor flawless once more, as if nothing had ever interrupted its perfection. But the memory remained, not in the surface, but in the way people moved, in the way they looked, in the subtle pause that would come the next time someone stood where they were not expected to be. And in that invisible space, something had shifted permanently, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. A reminder that dignity does not arrive with status, and does not disappear without it. And sometimes, the strongest moment is not when someone speaks louder, but when they stand still long enough for the truth to be seen without resistance, without noise, without anything left to hide.